Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a historic time we live in, isn't it always? But there are some earth-shattering, I think, political events taking place. Obviously, we've had Greenland and Ukraine's going on in Davos. This divergence between the United States and its erstwhile allies, Europe. And Europe appears to feel like they're being pushed away from the United States with some really confrontational politicking going on from Trump and his administration. And the same can be said for Canada. It looks like the Monroe Doctrine is at the forefront for the Trump administration. They want the Western Hemisphere, and that includes Canada as its 51st state of America approach. They want Greenland, they want Venezuela, they want Mexico, really, at least under their thumbs. And so Canada and Europe are wondering how to deal with the United States. And one thing to do to mitigate against the tariffs and the trade wars that the US is waging with pretty much everyone is to get together with everyone else and do trade deals. And so what we're seeing at the moment is a historic trade deal that's been completed between the EU and India. And when I say historic, I mean the biggest one in history. And we have Canada doing a trade deal with China. We have Canada getting closer to South Korea, potentially doing a big military deal there. And so there is potentially this scenario where the US is trying to flex, the Trump administration is trying to flex, but the end result is that everyone else looks stronger. And the US looks more and more isolated. At the same time, the dollar is tanking and people are selling off treasury bonds, and that appears to be continuing. And it looks like everything is backfiring potentially for the Trump administration. So we're going to look at that today. We're going to look at some of these trade deals. We're going to start by looking at Greenland as a way of segueing into these big trade deals. And we'll see where this leaves the United States. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share. Makes a difference to the channel and keeps you in the loop. Appreciate those who have already subscribed. Okay, let's look at the details here. As mentioned, I'm going to start with Greenland. The Pentagon has produced a new national defense strategy. So we heard the national security strategy. We talked about that. This was the kind of approach of the Trump administration, of the government, to national security for the United States. How is it going to position itself globally in terms of its military and security? The national defense strategy is pretty much the same thing, kinda, but it's how the Department of Defense translates a national security strategy into what they're doing. That's how I understand it. And what you appear to have here is a rushing in of Greenland and stuff. Greenland didn't feature in the national security strategy. And then it suddenly pops up in the national defense strategy. Who knew? It's almost like Greenland was an afterthought. It was another flex by Trump. Could have had a lot to do with the tech brothers trying to influence the Trump administration. It really wasn't a problem for national security because, of course, NATO is in control of Greenland. It comes under the auspices of the NATO alliance. And so it didn't need to feature in the national security strategy, and yet now it features in the national defense strategy, which downgrades China as the top threat and refocuses on the US homeland and Western Hemisphere. This is Politico reporting. It blames earlier governments for neglecting US strategic interests in places like Panama and Greenland. So now that features. But China is no longer seen as a threat. And this is the position in the US is doing these days, is that Russia and China aren't the threats. Now the threat is coming from its erstwhile allies in Europe. Just incredible. Europe is deprioritized in relative terms. China is still a concern, but no longer the main one. Russia, Iran, and North Korea are mentioned, but they're not central. They're not as prominent as threats in the document. And at the same time, the White House, the official White House handle on Twitter, releases this image, which is a mock-up of Donald Trump walking kind of hand in flipper with a penguin, with the American flag in the penguin's flipper, if you want to call it that, and the Greenland flag in the background. And of course, as anyone who has been to school knows polar bears don't exist on the South Pole and penguins don't exist on the North Pole. This is just ridiculous because it's just, as a metaphor, I guess, it's just wrong on so many levels. And the White House says, embrace the penguin. And then says the penguin does not concern himself with the opinions of those who cannot comprehend. I mean, what are you doing? What child is in charge of the White House communications? To which Michael Shirkin, agrees. There are no penguins in Greenland, number one. Number two, this has all the maturity of the brain rot reels my kids watch. Makes me wonder about the age of the kid who controls this account. So anyway, that is the kind of bellicose approach that the United States has with regard to Greenland. Now, Trump has said aboard Air Force One recently that he'll have something on Greenland in 2 weeks. So he tacoed on Greenland. Then, he was threatening 8 countries with tariffs who were sending troops to Greenland. But they were supposedly reacting to the US saying there's not enough security in Greenland. So Europe said, okay, we'll put some more security there. And then he whacked them with tariffs. Then this came to a head and he backed down just after Davos. Trump said that aboard Air Force One that he'll have something on Greenland in 2 weeks. We're playing with the greatest hits again. He doesn't have a plan or a clue what he's talking about, says this particular source. The idea is 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 week. And he keeps going to the old, we'll have something in a couple of weeks. Ola Jolson here, one of the prominent Greenlandic politicians, I believe, says the United States gets everything it wants. US President Donald Trump said in an interview with Fox Business Network in Davos, quote, we get it all, everything we want. We get everything we want without paying anything, Trump said. He added that the part of the Golden Dome missile defense system would be placed in Greenland. So he still has high hopes, it looks, for Greenland. But we do also hear that, according to Reuters, the US abandoned plans to seize Greenland due to the threat of impeachment against Trump. So he was genuinely afraid that if, particularly if the midterms were going to go the way they're looking at going, so the Democrats could seize the House of Representatives, which is important for investigations, and then the Senate as an outside chance of getting the Senate, then it could be impeachment city when it comes to Trump. So since early January, Trump and his team have been actively discussing such actions, but politicians from both parties have expressed concern that he might act without congressional approval. Lawmakers have warned White House officials that the president faces impeachment if he invades, and it could be that that is what pulled Trump back from getting involved too overtly in Greenland. But the idea is that Davos really showed the true colors of the Trump administration, with the Board of Peace, with talk of Greenland. Anyway, this is I think MS Now reporting on Davos.
Well, I think you're angry. I don't think you see what the president is displaying here as bravado. You see it as arrogance. You see it as bullying. You see it as the behavior of an aggressor, much akin to the behavior that you've seen from Russia in Ukraine. I think today was a fiasco. I think this visit to Davos so far has been a fiasco. People walked out on Howard Lutnick last night at an event. There was great, I've not talked to people in Davos recently and just after the president's remarks, and there was real unhappiness with what they heard. They felt he was rude and ignorant and offensive. But I have to say, more important than that, this is a watershed in history. What we are watching is the breakdown of an Atlantic alliance that has been the foundation of international peace for the past 80 years.
David Rothkopf is correct here. And what we're seeing is that divergence I was talking about. And now these alliances are breaking down. These allies are going, well, are we still allies? Right, let's get together with each other. Let's support each other. And let's look elsewhere to do our trade and to seek, economic and political comfort.
You don't get over the kind of insults he's offered to the Danes or the Canadians or the British or the French or anyone in Europe And that's where we are. I do not think we are going to go back to the kind of Atlantic alliance that we have had, at least until Trump is gone, but possibly for a long time after that, as Europeans look with skepticism on the stability of the US system that could produce an extremist who has such contempt for the international system as Donald Trump.
And that was really, really, I think, well put. Now, the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, said, I think, or I hope, that all Europeans can now see that it was a huge mistake to be dependent on Russian fossil fuels. We should never have been. And now we have to make sure that we will have no dependencies on other countries outside Europe, not only in energy. So this is Mette Frederiksen saying, right, we've been burnt by the Trump administration. We need no more dependencies on the Trump administration. And there is your foundation for the rest of this video. It really, Greenland, I think, crystallized Europe's already souring kind of sense of US, reliability, and has galvanized Europe to stick together and then look elsewhere. Just as an aside, this happened with Mark Carney, this happened with Anthony Albanese, Mark Carney in Canada, Anthony Albanese in Australia. But when Trump gets involved in other countries' elections or does things that are directly against another democratic nation, it does wonders for the polls in support of the anti-Trump politician, in this case Mette Frederiksen, not from being necessarily kind of pushing back against Trumpism, but literally just standing up for the Danish sovereignty. She was, and her party, established left-leaning party in Denmark, was in a bit of a trouble in the polls. They lost, I think, mayoral elections in Copenhagen recently. They didn't do too well there, and it was looking like in elections that they were going to take a bit of a beating. Well, today's Danish opinion poll from Megaphone is beyond crazy. The red bloc regains a majority, and the blue bloc loses 9% of the votes since last month. Danish politics has completely changed in just a month. She goes from looking Mette Frederiksen like she was on the way out to now having recovered much of what she'd lost. This is in large part due to her New Year's speech and the foreign political situation. So you can go and see the polling at various places. It's fascinating. Now, as to give us a segue onto the next section, although we're not going to go to Canada next, we're going to go to the EU. But Canada is sending a naval patrol vessel to Greenland for opening a new consulate. So this it's not like trolling, but it's like solidarity between Canada and Europe, I think. Canada, Greenland, and the EU. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand said Canada's, quote, principled pragmatism in foreign policy will now be on full display next week in Greenland when she opens Canada's new consulate in the Danish territory, with Inuit representatives attending and a Navy vessel in the background, according to City News. Wow. So Ola Jolson says, thank you to our neighbors in Canada. Thank you for your support. We look forward to welcoming you warmly. Really interesting kind of PR going on there, and optics. Now we're going to go to the EU and Ursula von der Leyen. I was just looking at her Twitter handle, Ursula von der Leyen. I started following her, actually, the president of the European Commission. I love the way that just her whole banner there is "We stand with Ukraine" and lots of Ukraine stuff in the background. So nice. Right. So what she just said, Europe and India are making history today. We have concluded the mother of all deals. We have created a free trade zone of 2 billion people, with both sides set to benefit. This is only the beginning. We will grow our strategic relationship to be even stronger. Wow. So EU and India are not messing about here. They signed this free trade agreement. It's supposed to double EU exports to India by 2032. So the EU is looking at not being able to sell much into the United States because the US is starting a trade war with the EU, putting tariffs on, and is looking more and more unreliable. So we need to look eastwards rather than westwards in Europe, she says, or Europeans have been saying. This agreement is supposed to reduce or eliminate tariffs on almost all EU exports to India. EU's tariffs on key industrial and manufactured goods will be cut or removed. The agreement will give EU companies a privileged access to India's services market. The document must still be ratified by necessary institutions. This is expected to happen within about a year. So it's a major milestone. So these things are never quick, right? These are huge documents and agreements. So, to be ratified within a year, there will be lots of crossing the T's and dotting the I's, but this is a huge movement. Nexter reports this on this historic agreement. The sides have agreed to eliminate or sharply reduce tariffs on 97% of European exports. Negotiations on the deal lasted almost 20 years, since 2007. Formal signing is expected after legal review and ratification in the European Parliament. India is making key concessions. Tariffs on all EU-made cars will be cut from 110% to 10%, and on wine from 150% to 75%. Wow. Some duties, including those on olive oil, will be abolished entirely. At the same time, the EU and India are signing a separate security and defense pact in New Delhi. Security and defense pact. Wow. So, of course, India have been buying Rafales from France, but traditionally have been in the kind of Russian orbit. Is this the EU being the ones to successfully pull India out of the Russian orbit? Something that the US would love to do, surely, and they would love to be selling all of their military hardware to India. So I guess there might be a little bit of tussle going on between these entities. Reuters notes that both the EU and India are hedging against unstable relations with the United States, a move that Washington is, to put it mildly, unhappy about. But the point is, this is partly the US is doing. I wonder whether really there would have been a deal done in this time frame had the US not been as confrontational as it has been. So taking tariffs down from 110% to 40% for cars, and then later to 10%, that is a huge move. But it's not just India. So the EU is set to elevate Vietnam ties to its highest partnership level. The EU is preparing to raise its relationship with Vietnam to its highest category of partnership, signaling a major step in political and economic cooperation. And why I've picked this one out is because Vietnam had a special relationship with the United States, as the US asked Vietnam to become its cheap clothing manufacturer instead of China. They wanted to pivot the US over decades from China making stuff for the US, and therefore US being dependent to some degree on China, to having Vietnam make this and have Vietnam much more likely to be in the US sphere of influence, which, Vietnam agreed to. They acquiesced to the US's demands. But then remember, on Liberation Day, the US went and hit Vietnam with the biggest tariffs. Why? Because there's such a massive trade deficit. Well, yeah, because you asked for that trade deficit. You said, we want to buy cheap clothes. Okay. We don't want to make them in the US because they'll be too expensive, and we want our peeps to have cheap clothing. If you want cheap clothing, then you can't make it where labor costs more in the United States. So you got to make them cheaply around the world. Okay, you're making it in China. No, we don't want China to make us our cheap clothes. We don't want to be sending money to China. We don't want to be depending too much on China. So we're going to get Vietnam to do that. So Vietnam, you're going to make us loads of cheap stuff. We're going to have a deal with you, blah, blah, blah. So then Trump administration comes along and says, there's a trade deficit here. We appear to be buying more from Vietnam than we're selling to Vietnam. Yeah, because they're a smaller country, much poorer country, and they're not going to buy as much from the US as we are going to buy from them. I mean, that's how it works, right? We're the rich country, says the US. So, of course, we've got a trade deficit. Oh, do we? Well, we're going to punish Vietnam for having a trade deficit with Vietnam. Vietnam goes, hang on, you asked us to build you to make your cheap sneakers and T-shirts and caps. Like, what are you doing? Why are we getting punished? Because there's a trade deficit, so we're punishing you. So then the EU, I mean, this is how I read it. EU comes along and says, we understand what's just happened. Do you want to have a special relationship with us? Yeah. The move would place Vietnam among the EU's closest strategic partners and reflect Hanoi's growing importance in Europe's plans for trade, investment, supply chain resilience, and regional stability in Southeast Asia. So now the EU is looking at stability in Southeast Asia, something that the US was heavily involved in. And, being in the Indo-Pacific region, in South Korea and the Philippines, this is surely in the US's wheelhouse. No, the EU's taking over, it looks. if confirmed, the upgrade, says Gandalf, is expected to deepen collaboration on areas such as green transition, critical industries, infrastructure, and security dialogue, while also expanding coordination on global issues. It would also underscore the EU's broader push to diversify partnerships in Asia amid shifting geopolitics and intensifying competition for influence in the region. Wow, fascinating. Now, moving aside from sort of trade deals, one thing that the EU is going to have to deal with is tech sovereignty, where the US has this tech almost monopoly in certain services and with these digital products. Europe is preparing a law to boost EU tech sovereignty. In fact, France has just come out, I think, and said that they're no longer going to do meetings using Teams and Zoom, I think, in the French government sector, and they're going to use a new a French provider for that. But anyway, let's hope it'll be market driven, says Emmanuel Pernod-Leplay. Real sovereignty is possible only if viable solutions come to life and are actually preferred by clients over the competition. The challenge is saying, well, we can't depend on US tech, so we're now going to use EU tech, but actually it's not as good, right? So you're forcing yourself to degrade your services and your efficiency and whatever it is because you're moving away from American tech. But there is this definite move going on at the moment. Europe prepares, says the Wall Street Journal, for a nightmare scenario, the US blocking access to tech. And because, a bit like, say, with the F-35s as a kill switch that the US has control over, the idea here is that if they control all of the cloud services, or if all the cloud services are American and all, you know, Microsoft and Google and Apple, these are all American operating systems and tech companies, then America potentially has a kill switch on tech. Now, obviously, it would mean that the US government would be willing and able to demand of their supposedly free enterprise tech companies that they do X, Y, and Z. Well, we have just seen, I don't know if you know all the controversy going on with TikTok. So now the US has a controlling stake in American TikTok. So the Trump administration, Larry Ellison, I think, David Ellison now sitting on the board and whatnot. TikTok is now, what's it doing? It is censoring Epstein, Minnesota protests, and anything to do with the shooting of Alex Pretty, so on and so forth. They are literally de-amplifying and censoring those topics. TikTok is now a plaything of the Trump administration, and that's happened over the last 48 hours. Incredible. I'm going to do a separate video on that, but that's a worry for Europe, where I think, you know, there's a lot to think about here, and Europe really needs to future-proof itself with regard to tech. Okay, so moving on, Der Spiegel, German media outlet, says the Trump era, I think, is that Donald is right, es reicht, Trumps Imperialismus, wie sich Europa behaupten kann. The Trump era could also become the second birth of the EU. An article in Spiegel argues the relations between the EU and the United States have changed, says Anton Gerashchenko. I think this is really, really important, exactly what we're just talking about. NATO is no longer the guarantee of safety because it's unclear what will take precedence in case of emergency, Article 5 or America First. In light of this, says the Spiegel, the EU needs to stop perceiving itself as vulnerable and weak, recognize and utilize its strengths, and present itself on the global arena from a point of strength. The EU is an unprecedented success story from the beginning, as it allowed to create a strong and peaceful union after hundreds of years of war, summarizes Gerashchenko. Europe must be, quote, prepared to defend her own territory and sovereignty outwardly and to fight with those forces that ally with the enemies of Europe. It must learn to use its economic power as a political weapon and to strategically promote its industry in order not to become blackmailable. And at the same time, it must form alliances with countries and regions that oppose US imperialism, the authors recommend. So that is huge. And that is what we're talking about. This is today's video. This is the last sentence. At the same time, it must form alliances with countries and regions that oppose US imperialism. So in order to do that, Europe needs, according to the article, a standardized defense and arms policy. Less variety of systems means more stability, predictability, and speed. A central regulating organ must be necessary to make these decisions. Possibly its own nuclear umbrella, otherwise the threat of Russia's nuclear blackmail will always remain. A way to proceed quickly and efficiently. The principle of unanimity might have to become a relic from the past that weakens Europe. I've talked about this before. You cannot have unanimous votes in so many of these areas where, unfortunately, Hungary just gets to dictate what Europe can't do. An alliance of core countries that will provide security for the continent: Germany, France, Britain, Italy, Poland, and ideally Ukraine. Use its economic strengths as a leverage. The EU is an economic giant. Quote, the EU has a power to break up cartels and enforce market rules. It can punish companies that see themselves as an instrument of political disinformation and blackmail. Europe just has to want it, the authors conclude. Absolutely, yeah. So that is what we're about today. Now, at the same time, I've talked about treasuries being sold off across Europe, certain nations like Denmark and Sweden and other Netherlands as well. I think China also selling off treasuries. This weakens the dollar, makes it more expensive for the US to borrow. Here we hear that Gandalf reports that trust is the ultimate currency in Berlin. In Berlin, it's running low, with over $100 billion in German gold actually sitting in Manhattan. The calls for repatriation are no longer coming from the fringes. This is about sovereignty in an area of shifting alliances and trade wars. Germany wants its safety net within reach, not across the Atlantic. The era of blind trust is over. Wow. So, and I don't know what the impact would be of Germany taking back its gold. I presume that they must pay the US a pretty penny to look after it. Anyway, it's starting. The vice president of Germany's football association calls for a debate about boycotting this year's World Cup because of Trump. So I don't think that'll happen, but it is certainly a potential. And you've got 75 nations the US has stopped processing visas for. Well, 11 of those, is it, are at the World Cup? Well, how are their players and their coaching staff and their fans going to get to the World Cup? So there's a lot to sort out there, but the US is, again, doing everything it can to just annoy everyone else. And everyone else is just getting fed up at the moment. And of course, when I'm talking about the US, I mean the Trump administration. I don't mean all the good, wonderful people in the United States. So German Foreign Office has just issued a formal travel warning for the US. The reason: violent clashes with migration and security authorities, ICE, in Minneapolis and other cities. This is not a narrative. It's an official security alert for European citizens. When state authorities become a threat to allies and journalists, says this source, the cards have officially changed. Wow. And this comes on the back of, and the same Anna de Milanese reports that ICE threatened to smash in the windows of an RAI crew today, which is an Italian media outlet. Journalists had to barricade themselves in their car. RAI is a state broadcaster. So the Italian state broadcaster, this wasn't a police check. It was a direct assault on the Italian state. Meloni's allies are hunting her reporters. She remains silent. Calling this a partnership is insanity. So obviously someone here, Anna de Milanese, not a fan of Meloni. But yeah, just incredible stuff. And that's caught on camera there. So, there are warnings going out from the official German government as to traveling to the United States. At the same time, as I reported yesterday, 10 European nations, including the UK, agree to a Hamburg Declaration, where a North Sea offshore wind grid of 100 gigawatt capacity will be jointly constructed, and there'll be interconnectors between these nations. Signing will take place on Monday. Well, signing has taken place. It will power 143 million homes. That's looking good. In fact, here we see, according to Reuters, Britain, Germany, Denmark, and other European countries signing this clean energy pact at a summit in Hamburg, pledging to deliver 100 gigawatts of offshore wind power through large-scale joint projects. And this is the sort of thing you can see more of. I think the galvanizing in Europe of nations around ideas of economic security and stability, and just national security and stability. And I think Ukraine has to be a part of this, but this really needs to be understood in the context of, Donald Trump. And this is why there's a video on this of, Reuters is playing a video of Donald Trump speaking at Davos there when we're talking about Britain, Germany, and other European nations getting together for an energy security deal. Now, at the same time, and I don't know if this has anything to do with it, but I get a sense that countries are now looking inwards, as well as other countries that have been doing a lot of trade and have these great long-lasting relationships with the United States are now being pushed away and have to do kind of two things. One, if the US is being protectionist and going America first, it actually motivates other countries and entities to be protectionist. So Europe is going to say, right, we need to produce our own IT, for example, tech, whatever it is, widgets. Like, we can't use American widgets, we've got to use our own widgets. So we are going to protect our own widget industry. We're going to buy from ourselves, and we might give, protectionist tariffs to this industry so that we have infant industry protectionism or some kind of industry protectionism. It's not that IT industry is in its infancy, but essentially for Europe, it kind of is, in terms of like, they have a small child of a tech industry compared to the behemoth that is the American tech industry. So they need to protect that. So there's going to be this protectionism, as well as actually just replacing the US with other entities around the world: China, India, Vietnam, Mercosur, South America, Canada. Definitely Canada, UK, right, from a EU point of view. But the UK here says UK lenders step up with £11 billion push to back British businesses. So, let's forget about pure free market economics here, and let's just think about protecting our own industry rather than giving our money outside of our countries to these other. And this is the tension between people who, so many Americans, particularly conservative Americans, Republicans, always were big on the free market, right? And Ayn Rand and libertarianism. But that doesn't seem to be the case anymore, as the US puts up walls around its own economy to say America first, America first, America first, and then tariffs everyone. Tariffs are anathema to free marketeers. So those who used to be advocating day in, day out for free markets seem to be rather quiet now that the US has gone to America first. So it never really was about free market ideology, really. It was about just kind of like, free market's great if you're buying American stuff or something. I don't know. Just clearly there's some issues going on in the minds of free marketeers these days, I would have thought. But yeah, UK banks agree £11 billion lending packages to support small business growth, particularly for small and mid-sized enterprises. And I don't know if that's got anything to do with the geopolitical situation, but it could just kind of fit in with it. Now, how, says Jim Sciutto from CNN, how will the US respond if a foreign leader encourages the US state to succeed? Right, so we're going from the EU now to Canada, and my segue into that is this extraordinary comment from Scott Bessent here. I think, was this in Davos or after Davos? Anyway.
In the US, more than our northern neighbor.
That's even with all the oil and the natural resources coming out of Canada. Texas still larger.
Well, look.
And this is Jack Posobiec, who is a horrible human being and one of these right-wing influencers that is right in the heart of the American administration these days. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary here, talking about Canada.
Alberta is a wealth of natural resources, but they won't let them build a pipeline to the Pacific. I think we should let them come down into the U.S., and Alberta is a natural partner for the U.S. They have great resources. The Albertans are very independent people. Rumored that they may have a referendum on whether they want to stay in Canada or not.
Sounds like you may know something up there.
People are saying, people
are talking.
People are talking. People want sovereignty. They want what the U.S. has got, because when I look at Europe, how can they have sovereignty? They don't have immigration sovereignty. They've let their borders be overrun. They don't have economic sovereignty. They are dependent on China, and they do not have a security sovereignty because they are so far behind on defense and rare earths. They need to live under the U.S. security umbrella, and we are happy to have them in the umbrella. President Trump has asked them to contribute a fair amount the allocated amount that they are to NATO.
So this is Scott Bessent basically advocating for Albertan's succession into the United States. Now, how would the US respond if a foreign leader encouraged the US state to succeed? Imagine that there was talk in Canada, official talk from government representatives to try and get, I don't know, Maine or Minnesota or
In the US,
Oregon or I don't know, Montana or any of these sort of states to come and join Canada. That would be a really confrontational situation. But it's just incredible. They're just talking up, like taking on, in this case, Alberta. Now, actually, the stats don't support accession. Yeah, there is more of an accession from Canada movement in Alberta than anywhere else in Canada, but it's not nearly enough to get across the line there. But I think that's really dangerous rhetoric from Scott Bessent. Now, to add to that, I mean, goodness me, let's go to Donald Trump. He's king of this kind of rhetoric. Dear Prime Minister Carney, he said the other day, this is back on the 23rd, 4 days ago, please let this letter serve to represent that the Board of Peace is withdrawing its invitation to you regarding Canada's joining. That will be the most prestigious board of leaders ever assembled at any time. Of course, most European leaders, apart from Viktor Orban, have declined it. Thank you for your attention to this matter, says Donald J. Trump. So he petulantly rescinds the offer to Mark Carney to sit on the Board of Peace. And then we had the whole the threat of trade war with Canada getting closer to China. So it started off, or it showed itself here in Donald Trump saying, if Governor Carney thinks he is going to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States, he is sorely mistaken. So calling him governor again. This is what he did with Justin Trudeau, isn't it? China will eat Canada alive, completely devour it, including the destruction of their businesses, social fabric, and general way of life. If Canada makes a deal with China, it's really unsure what a deal means. I mean, Canada is going to make it. Canada already has a deal with China, right? And then they're just adapting that deal. So what are you saying? That they're not allowed to do that? It will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the USA. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Trump just threatened Canada with a 100% tariff if Mark Carney finalizes a deal with China, and he called him governor again because disrespect is the whole strategy. This is extortion. If you don't obey, we'll punish your entire economy. And we're going to return to this idea of the US punishing Canada for Canada's own having its own sovereignty. Quite incredible. Trump threatens major escalation against Canada, though it's not clear what he means by a deal, says Josh Wingrove there. Now, Trump threatening with 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods is not 25%, it's not 35%, it's 100%. It's the most severe trade threat ever issued against the Five Eyes ally, says Shanaka Anselm Pereira. But here is what you're not being told. 8 days ago, Mark Carney stood in Beijing's Great Hall of the People and did something no Canadian Prime Minister has done in 9 years. He slashed Canada's 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles to 6.1%. He signed 8 memorandums of understanding with Beijing. He declared progress towards a new world order. So in that speech, he was talking about how the US is not predictable anymore, that China is more predictable than the US, and that we're moving towards this new world order. And he's absolutely right on all of those points. 4 days ago at Davos, Carney announced the rules-based order is fading. It's not coming back. Trump's response today, if Governor Carney thinks he's going to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States, he's totally mistaken. Note the word governor. Here is what the consensus is missing entirely. USMCA article. So this is a trade agreement that replaced the previous trade agreement. This is the one that Trump actually sorted out in Trump 1.0. The article 32.1, 3210, the poison pill. This clause gives the United States the right to expel Canada from the US-Mexico-Canada agreement if Ottawa enters a free trade deal with a non-market country. So China is this non-market country. It's not a free market, and that's what the US is doing. Now, Pereira here says China is that country. Canada just signed that deal. Now, this is people have been reacting to China and Canada signing a deal that people, I think, are misinterpreting it as a free trade deal. It is a trade deal. It's not a free trade deal. It's a trade deal where they're just readjusting some of their tariffs on each other. And we'll look at the details in a second. But it's not that Canada has gone against the USMCA. And there are certain people on both sides that are claiming, I saw Eric Doherty, these perennially online right-wing influencers saying, this is Canada's backing down, because Mark Carney then came out and said, we're not doing a free trade deal with Canada. No, he's not backing down. He's just indicating that we're doing a trade deal. It's just not a free trade deal. So we're not in contravention of this USMCA. So anyway, so we'll read what Pereira says here, but I think he's slightly wrong in the interpretation of the deal. He says Canada just signed that deal. I don't think they did. They signed a different deal. They signed a trade deal, but not a free trade deal. Trump is not bluffing. He is triggering the clause that was designed for exactly this scenario. But go deeper. In August 2019, Mark Carney stood at Jackson Hole and proposed replacing dollar dominance with a synthetic hegemonic currency. The exact phrase he used, quote, dampen the domineering influence of the US dollar on global trade. This is not a trade dispute. This is a 7-year thesis being executed by a former Goldman Sachs partner who ran both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. Carney is not improvising. He is implementing. The strategic paradox Washington created. Every action designed to force Canadian compliance is accelerating Canadian defection. 35% tariffs, Carney went to Beijing. 51st state threats, Carney signed 8 memorandums of understanding. USMCA declared irrelevant, Carney slashed EV tariffs. 100% tariff threat, Canada now has nothing left to lose. The binding mechanism, when you threaten economic annihilation against an ally, they do not become more compliant, they become more diversified. Trump did not push Canada towards China, Trump delivered Canada to China. This is a signature failed mode of coercive hegemony. It works until it does not. And when it stops working, it accelerates the very outcome it sought to prevent. 49,000 Chinese EVs now enter Canada at 6.1% tariff. That quota represents a beachhead. Within 5 years, over 50% must be priced under 35,000 Canadian dollars. That is BYD, that is NIO, that is CATL batteries, that is Fortress North America with a Chinese door. Watch the Canadian dollar and US dollar. Watch the USMCA review in July of this year. Watch whether Mexico follows Canada's template. America's building the multipolar world it fears, one ally at a time. So although I think this deal isn't the deal he says, a free trade deal, actually everything else there is probably quite correct. There's this, and I talked about this the other day in my video on the economy and the US dollar cratering and gold and silver going up and US dollar being only 40% of international currency reserves, where it used to be 60%. People are, like BRICS was designed, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and all the other nations are involved with that. Their intention is to get the US dollar not being the international currency of trade, that there will be alternatives there because it gives, quote, an exorbitant privilege to the United States. The United States does very well out of the dollar being the currency of international trade in a way that no other country does that well. Now, the euro, the pound, the yen, maybe yuan even, could be, gaining in prominence as the dollar struggles. But yet Canada here, and Mark Carney particularly, arguably running with that and doing deals with China that accelerates a situation whereby we move towards a multipolar world, that the US isn't this big reliable trading partner anymore, and that's a result of Donald Trump's rhetoric and actions. As Anthony Scaramucci says, in response to Donald Trump's threats to Canada, Carney has broken him. Carney has broken Trump here. Now, this is Mark Carney talking about the supposed free trade deal.
How are you responding to Trump's threats about 100% tariffs?
Well, the first thing is that Canada respects our engagements, our commitments. Il y a des engagements dans l'ACM. We have commitments under CUSMA
CUSMA or USMCA, depending on how you say it. CUSMA is Canada, US, Mexico,
want to pursue free trade agreements with non-market economies without prior notification. We have no intention of doing that with China or any other non-market economy. What we've done with China is to rectify some issues that developed in the last couple of years. In many respects, we're going, to use the expression, back to the future with respect to EVs, with respect to agriculture, with respect to fish products and other food products, but with additional protections. So for example, back in 2023, we didn't have a cap on the number of EVs. We didn't have a requirement for a large proportion of those EVs to be affordable, highly affordable EVs for Canadians. So it's entirely consistent with CUSMA, with our obligations, which we very much respect under CUSMA and will continue to work that way forward.
So to translate, it's not a free trade deal. They're tinkering with the trade deal that exists. And Justin Trudeau changed that trade deal previously. He says we're going back to the future. We're going back to prior to what Justin Trudeau did. So, but with some protections. So Justin Trudeau whacked a massive tariff on electric vehicles coming in from China in response to demands from the US to do so, if I remember correctly. So Justin Trudeau aligned Canada with the US to protect the auto industry, the car industry in the United States from cheap Chinese electric vehicles. But now that the US is becoming unreliable, Canada's having to look to China to sell stuff to China. And one of the things they want to sell to China are canola seeds and canola and other agricultural products. And in order to do that, to get the tariffs reduced on canola, they need to reduce tariffs on electric vehicles, but they cap them at 49,000 a year, and then said that, and they have to be cheap enough for our peeps to afford them. So it is a lot more subtle what's going on. Just to read you what CBC is reporting, it's fairly early into the deal, but the two countries have essentially agreed to lift or lower tariffs on certain products. The Canadian government has agreed to allow 49,000 EVs, Chinese EVs, into the market at a tariff rate of 6.1%, a measure that had been in place before Ottawa put a 100% tariff on all Chinese EVs in 2024. So again, just reverting. In exchange, Carney says he expects China to lower tariffs on Canadian canola to 15%. By March, Beijing will also remove tariffs on Canadian canola meal, lobsters, crab, and peas as of March until at least the end of 2026. Carney's team also told Canada's premiers, so the people in charge of these different regions, provinces, in a briefing call on Friday, that the two sides have made progress to resolve issues around Canadian pork exports, according to sources with knowledge of the call, but Chinese tariffs on pork remain in place. So anyway, and you can go and see like the history of them slapping tariffs on each other, but it's kind of going back to where they were, but it might cause problems for the CUSMA or USMCA review later this year. And you know, Trump is not happy.
Prime Minister Martinez Davis, New York Times. After your visit, is it fair to say that you're concluding that China is a more predictable and maybe reliable partner to Canada than the United States is today?
Well, let me answer it. I'm going to answer it directly with respect to the relations with China and our engagement with China. And I will say that from the first conversation I had with Premier Lee, telephone conversation, then the meeting in New York, the long meeting with President Xi in Korea, and then the meetings over the course of the last few days. There are a number of specific issues, and I've outlined them that where we've made progress in our strategic partnership. But we spent a fair bit of time in all of those meetings about the guardrails, if you will, of the relationship, where we felt we could cooperate, where we had differences of opinion, where we had differences of view in the system, respecting each other's differences in the system. And that sort of candid and consistent dialogue, frank dialogue, that leads to a more predictable and effective relationship. Our relationship, the one comparison I will give you with the United States, our relationship, this is no insight, is much more multifaceted, much deeper, much broader than it is with China. But yes, in terms of the way that our relationship has progressed in recent months with China, it is more predictable, and you see results coming from that.
So you can read that in two ways. You could read it that he's saying our relationship with China is more predictable than our relationship with China was previously. So he's saying our relationship with China has become more predictable. But you could also read that as answering the question, in the context of trade, our relationship with China is more predictable than our relationship with the US, which of course is incredibly damning. But he also says, but our relationship with the US is much more multifaceted. We do security arrangements. We're part of NATO. We do exercises. Our relationship with the US is far more complicated and deep-seated than the relationship with China. But essentially, so what you've got here is Canada opening itself to more electric vehicles from China, and China opening itself to agricultural products from Canada. So Canadian farmers are super happy with this, but the automakers are not happy with this, or at least that was the initial response. And Trump jumped on this. So he says this is a must watch, which is some Canadian, I don't know, probably something to do with Ontario. I don't know if it's a politician or a part lobbying for the car companies, but Trump says this is a must watch. Canada is systematically destroying itself. The China deal is a disaster for them. Will go down as one of the worst deals of any kind in history. All their businesses are moving to the USA. I want to see Canada survive and thrive. So in this video, you've got, and I'm not going to play it, I'm just going to tell it to you because it's 2 minutes 20. You basically got a Canadian saying, we need to watch out because this sucks for the car industry because we're letting in Chinese electric vehicles. We need to protect our workers and protect our car industry, etc., which you can imagine that's sensible. So as good as it is to have a trade deal with the Chinese improved, it's give or take. Yeah, agriculturally, Canadians are really happy, but in terms of car industry, not so much. But then, so the idea, and I don't know the details here, but I would assume then what Mark Carney needs to then do, and his government, is to go to the car industry and say, right, we've done this deal. You're going to see 49,000 electric vehicles tops come into the country a year. They're going to be at this price point. We're capping it. We're capping the number and the price, blah, blah, blah. How can we protect the Canadian car industry so that our products are competitive with these products? What do we need to do? Blah, blah, blah. So Doug Ford, as you can see here, he was, I think, standing behind this guy over there. So obviously was initially unhappy with the trade deal with China. CP24 here reports that Doug Ford calls federal auto strategy great. So then they've come up with a federal car strategy, auto strategy, the Canadians, the Liberal government, and says Ontario will be part of it after meeting with Carney and Joly. So he seems to have come around. So this looks like then Mark Carney has done a good job in saying, right, I understand that everyone's going to be annoyed in the car industry, so we now need to have a car strategy that deals with the trade deal that we've done with China, supports our car industry, but also enables us to have this trade deal with China that will support our agricultural industry. But all of this is a reaction to, this needn't have happened, you could argue, if Trump hadn't gone to town on Canada, threatening Canada to be in becoming the 51st state of America, threatening Canada with tariffs and trade wars, and actually slapping on tariffs previously to Canadian products. And of course, when you've got a car industry that revolves around sending stuff across the border multiple times to make these vehicles, as the two countries work together in the same production lines, tariffs are just insanely counterproductive. So, Canada's naturally looking elsewhere. And then that leads me on to this. Fascinating. So Canada is preparing to buy up to 12 conventionally powered submarines as Mark Carney ramps up defense spending, a move that would rank among the largest military procurements in Canadian history at a price tag of 20 to 24 billion Canadian dollars. Talk about a strategic shift. But the key point to this is, it's not just buying 12 submarines. It's buying them off where? South Korea. So Seoul sends an envoy, industry giants, to Canada in a submarine push, in a push to get them to buy submarines from South Korea. Then I was reading today in the Globe and Mail that South Korean submarine maker Hanwha has signed an agreement with Algoma Steel, which is a Canadian steel manufacturer. So if you're going to buy these submarines from South Korea, and South Korea is saying, well, we're going to build these submarines, we're going to get steel from Canada, then Canada's doing a sensible kind of deal. South Korean submarine maker Hanwha announced Monday it had signed a flurry of partnership agreements with Canadian companies, including Salt STE, Marie's tariff battered. I don't know what that stands for, but anyway, a tariff battered Algoma Steel. So this steel company that appears to have been battered by tariffs, one assumes tariffs with the United States, now gets a lifeline from South Korea in terms of building submarines. And lo and behold, South Korea is looking for Canada to buy 12 submarines off them. At the same time, they're saying, and we can do a deal with your Algoma Steel. As it vies for a massive Canadian military procurement contract, Hanwha Ocean said it signed a memorandum of understanding with Algoma that pledges $275 million in financial support to stand up a new structural steel beam mill. The pact also declares Hanwha's intention to purchase steel products for both the construction of Canada's new submarine fleet and the maintenance infrastructure on both coasts to support it. Both commitments come on the condition that Hanwha wins Ottawa's massive multi-billion-dollar procurement contract to supply the Royal Canadian Navy with up to 12 modern submarines. So there you go. And it will involve Canadian infrastructure on both coasts of Canada to support those submarines. And so there's an awful lot that, there are, I think, other cooperation agreements as well, as you can see listed here. So not just that steel provider. But I think this is really significant. So what we have is the US peeing off Canada, Canada getting closer to China, Canada getting closer to Europe and the EU, Canada getting closer to South Korea, maybe looking at doing a massive military deal that supports their own steel industry, because their own steel industry has been hit by the United States. And then South Korea getting into bed with Canada to do this deal. And that all looks pretty standard. And then we hear this, Donald Trump, our trade deals are very important to America. In each of these deals, he said this is on the 27th, this is today, we have acted swiftly to reduce our tariffs in line with the transaction agreed to. We, of course, expect our trading partners to do the same. South Korea's legislature is not living up to its deal with the United States. President Lee and I reached a great deal for both countries on July the 30th, 2025, and we reaffirmed these terms while I was in Korea on October the 29th, 2025. Why hasn't the Korean legislature approved it? Because the Korean legislature hasn't enacted our historic trade agreement, which is their prerogative. I am hereby increasing South Korean tariffs on autos, lumber, pharma, and all other reciprocal tariffs from 15% to 25%. Thank you for your attention to this matter. So Trump has now started a even greater, well, there's already tariffs on South Korea, but now increase those tariffs another 10% to 25% on really significant Korean goods. Is that an answer to Canada going to South Korea to do a deal on submarines and steel and all sorts? Wow. Wow. Then we hear this. So unreal, says this source. The US is now basically, the source is CBC originally, is basically threatening that if Canada doesn't buy all of their F-35s, so remember they had this deal to buy 88 F-35s, where they have to buy 16 of them, but then the US started being annoying with regard to Ukraine and an unreliable ally. So Canada said, well, actually, we're going to buy the 16, but all the rest, we're going to spend that money on maybe Gripens from Saab from Sweden, right? And that gets us closer to Sweden. And then Saab said, if you buy Gripens, we'll build a plant in Canada, and that's 10, 12,000 employees, whatever it is. You can have jobs for buying Gripens. So now the US is saying, if you don't buy all of the F-35s that we want you to, our military will freely operate in your country without your permission. So if you don't buy F-35s, we're going to fly our F-35s into Canada. So US will have to send its own fighter jets into Canadian airspace if Ottawa doesn't buy 88 F-35s, says the US ambassador to Canada. Wow. This is annoying people like Dean Blundell, who says the following.
Hey, Dean, here with the Save America movement. Just got to dinner. Finished a couple of podcasts today with Ken Harbaugh, Malcolm Nance, Congressman Denver Riggland was just handed a note as we finished up our day talking to the people of Greenland. That Donald Trump and the Trump regime intend on sending F-35s and jets into Canada if we do not buy his F-35 jets. Let me just repeat that and put it in plainer words. Donald Trump just said he would attack Canada if we didn't buy his F-35 Lockheed Martin pieces of shit. I have some news that I would like you to share with everybody. The deal for the Swedish Gripen, Saab, it's done. We're not buying those. So, I guess it's Donald Trump's move. You're going to see an announcement in the next week or two. And I would challenge Canadians to heartily push back. I would challenge Mark Carney and the government of Canada to just do the right thing. Just do the right thing. Do not give in. Do not appease the script. All you have to do is do the deal for Canada. That's it. That's all you have to do. Saab Griffin, 12,000 jobs. You cannot do business with the United States. You do not spend billions and billions of taxpayer dollars by being threatened into it. Donald Trump, Pete Hegseth, Canada, loudly and proudly is going to tell you to go fuck yourself. Go fuck yourself.
So apologies for the swearing there, but Dean Blundell, I wanted to interview him actually some time back. I never got around to it. Really like not happy with the United States. And that, you know, and that must be really difficult for decent American citizens, like viewers of this channel, to hear what should be your closest friends and neighbors say things like this to you. You're like, why? How have we got to this position? Donald Trump has got you to that position by shooting the United States in the foot, by threatening. Then people turn around, and then when they turn around, they say, you can't turn around. I'm going to threaten you even more. So now they're threatening, the US is threatening to send planes into Canadian airspace without their say-so. Absolutely incredible. And he says the deal, we're not going to buy F-35s. The deal is done, he says. So you might have insider information there. The deal is done for the Gripens. 12,000 jobs into Canada. Thank you very much. We're going to buy Gripens. At the same time, Canada and India pledged to grow oil, petroleum, and trade in an energy reset. Ottawa will commit to ship more crude oil, LNG, and LPGs to India. So this is great for Canada as India is pivoting away from Russia, while New Delhi will send more refined petroleum products to Canada, according to a joint statement. Does that replace American trade? Well, possibly might replace LNG going from the US to India, or it might replace refined goods coming from the US up into Canada by refined products coming from India. Absolutely insane. So Jason Kenney here says, Martin, with precisely zero provocation, Martin Pelletier, who said the USMCA, so the CUSMA or US-Mexico-Canada deal is toast this June. Carney just pissed off our largest trading partner ahead of negotiations. Let's hope he gets his majority soon. He can back off. So this is a portfolio manager, investment pro economist, blah, 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 saying that the USMCA is toast and because Carney's just annoyed Trump. So Jason Kenney says, Martin, with precisely zero provocation, Trump said a year ago that he intended to annex Canada and make it the 51st state by applying economic pressure. He imposed, lifted, increased, decreased, reimposed, and repeatedly threatened tariffs on everything imported from Canada in gross violation of the CUSMA agreement that he signed, calling it the greatest trade agreement in history. He initially did so on entirely specious grounds that Canada was a major source of fentanyl imports and illegal migration to the US. Do you remember that? Do you remember that, guys? Both claims completely contradicted by data and US law enforcement agencies. The claims were so ridiculous even for Trump that he has not repeated them in the past 10 months. He has repeatedly said the US needs nothing from Canada, specifically mentioning our energy. He continues to maintain crippling sectoral tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminium, and certain auto components in violation of CUSMA, tariffs that are costing the Canadian economy billions of dollars and thousands of jobs. Senior administration officials, Greer, Lutnick et al., have been intimating for months that CUSMA will not be renewed. Trump has repeatedly referred to the Canada-US border as imaginary and fake. His insults and provocations are too many to list, but just in the last week, he has said that Canada has been, quote, completely taken over by China because of discrete tariff agreement requested by Western provinces and initially, quote, endorsed by Trump. And insulted the honor and memory of our troops, claiming that they, quote, stayed a little back from the front lines in Afghanistan. Given all of that and more, you blame the Prime Minister of Canada for CUSMA being in jeopardy? What the hell? After a year of this, how can we still have some Canadians blaming Canada for Trump taking a wrecking ball to the relationship? Under these circumstances, Prime Minister Carney has exercised remarkable restraint. What would satisfy you? Groveling subservience, giving the US total control over our trade relations with the rest of the world? We Canadians can and should debate the most prudent way to deal with the completely unpredictable and destabilizing threat from Trump. I, for one, don't support the recent deal with China, but surely no reasonable person can conclude that Canada provoked or is in any meaningful way to blame for this crisis. Really well said there. Let's get the context right and who is doing the damage here. Mark Carney's approval are kind of showing here that Canadians do understand who is doing the damage, and it's Trump. And as a result, Mark Carney's approval ratings are going up. They look like nothing else in a modern era, says this source, showing that his approval rating is 60% approval, 34% disapproval going down, and approval going up considerably. Quite incredible there. And in fact, more granular detail, net approval of Carney plus 29 amongst all people, women up 32, men up 25, 18 to 35-year-olds up 24, 35 to 49 up 23, 50 to 64 up 36, 65 plus up 33. So older people like him a lot more, but even younger people fairly consistently approve more of Carney. And remember, this is in the context of the US manufacturing in trouble, AI going to give I think a real challenge to the US economy. You've got poor jobs data, you've got inflation is still an issue, you've got the US dollar tanking, you've got US treasuries being used as leverage, US dollar as a share of global currency reserves falling to 40% from kind of 60% or more as a high. There are challenges for the US, and at the same time, they're damaging their international relationships that they should be leaning on in order to get them out of a prickly economic situation. US freight shipments are collapsing. The Cass Freight Index, a key measurement of freight volumes, fell to 0.93 in December, the lowest since the 2020 crisis low. So during the pandemic, when people weren't shipping stuff around. Excluding 2020, this is the lowest level since the Great financial crisis. Freight shipments have declined for 3 years straight. This signals weakening demand for shipping and goods movement and a slower economy. Is the real economy in a recession? US hiring is at recession levels. US employers announced only 507,647 planned hires, down 34% year on year, the lowest annual total since 2010. This includes just 372,520 seasonal positions in quarter four, the lowest since tracking began in 2012. So, like, these are domestic issues for the US, and at the same time, the US is pushing away Canada, pushing away Mexico, pushing away Europe. China is getting into bed with all the aforementioned, as is India, and at the same time, inside the US, California's economy is growing at a faster rate than the world's top three economies. In 2024, California's growth rate at 6% outpaced the top three economies of the US at 5.3%, China at 2.6%, and Germany at 2.9%. California's success is long-term. The state's economy grew strongly over the last 4 years with an average nominal GDP growth of 7.5% from 2021 to 2024. Right, so California is doing well, whilst at the same time Newsom is being attacked, although in private he seems to have an okay conversation with Trump, but in public Trump is denigrating Newsom, denigrating California. Lowe's on the right saying California is this liberal state which is X, Y, and Z, but at that time, while it does have its challenges, economically it is growing. And then just to add to that, Gavin Newsom has announced that California will be the first state to join the World Health Organization. So Trump has pulled the US out of the World Health Organization, and Newsom has taken California into the World Health Organization. So not only are all the nations outside of the US pushing away from the US, but states within the US are getting so pissed off with Trump and his direction that they're unilaterally taking themselves to do things that the nation state of the United States was previously doing. This is in direct defiance of Donald Trump, who just pulled the US out of World Health Organization. So much going on at the moment. It's absolutely fascinating, but I'm sorry to say it yet again, but Donald Trump is destroying the United States' good name and its soft power and its hard power around the world. And all that leaves is Trump able to and willing to threaten people. It's just threat. And actually people respond to threats by going, well, if you're going to threaten us, we're going to just get closer to all these other nations and peoples. We're going to do closer deals with China and India, which you wouldn't want us to do otherwise. But stop, you pushed us to this position. So anyway, that's my kind of analysis. I know it's a big one, but I think it required this much thought and this much evidence, and showing just hopefully gives you a full understanding of what's going on. I'm just one guy. I don't know that I've got this right. I don't know enough about Canadian politics and the Canadian economy to make sure that I know that I have a kind of coherent view of affairs here, but this all looks fairly coherent to me, and it definitely appears that the United States is pushing nations away, and they're happily just getting on with working with each other rather than working with the United States. And I think that's not to the benefit of ordinary working people in the United States. Honestly, Donald Trump is the worst enemy of the people of the United States, and they just need to stand up to him and push back, because he's not doing the US any economic or political favors. That's enough for me. Take care. Speak soon.